I just want to welcome us all today and encourage us to get comfortable with ourselves and each other and with this process as best we can. And in way of opening comments, I want to share something that is from my tradition, the Buddhist tradition. There's a text that accounts for the experience of the monks at the death of the Buddha. And it's a pretty good description of the spectrum of grief responses that we might have when someone we love has died, when we lose someone we love. And to paraphrase, it says something like, these monks that had not yet overcome their passions wept and tore out their hair, and raising their arms and throwing themselves down on the earth, they were twisting and turning. But then there were monks who were free from craving, and they endured mindfully and spent their time clearly contemplating all compound things are impermanent. Now, this passage is followed by some advice that honestly has always troubled me. And not because it's not true, but because it's so easily misunderstood. And because in my experience anyway, advice rarely helps when it comes to grief. So the passage goes something like, there's an old venerable monk that says, "Enough of your weeping and wailing. Hasn't our teacher told us that all things are changeable and impermanent, subject to separation? So what's all this, my friends? Whatever is born is subject to decay." That's the advice. So the question emerges for me when I read this and here this morning with you is, how do we move toward the light of absolute truth and still accept our very human, relative, personal nature? I don't think it's by suppressing our grief, nor attempting some kind of spiritual bypass around it. I think that we have to be willing to meet the sometimes difficult and dark emotions that are part of our experience of loss. We might want to really transcend, by reaching for the truth of impermanence, or our spiritual friends or our superego tells us, just let go, just let go. But in my experience, there's no letting go until there's letting in. So a wiser, maybe more compassionate approach is to trust the process through grief, to recognize it as a path from fragmentation to wholeness. And allowing the grief allows us to move through to non-grieving. Now, personally, I might have liked to identify with the monks who were free of craving, but more likely, I would have been with the ones who were weeping and wailing. And it would have been helpful for me if someone sat beside me, maybe listened, accompanied me in my sorrow, and I believe I could feel their love and their concern for me if they didn't want me to be anything special, anything else, And in that kind of heart-to-heart exchange, that kind of loving exchange with someone who could be with my suffering, that would be more valuable to me than 1,000 truthful words. Maybe, just maybe, I would eventually be able to raise my head and see their face. And maybe they would have the eyes of compassion. And maybe I would feel understood. So in our time together today, what I really want to do is be real with each other, be human with each other, to find a way to go toward our grief and to have it embraced by loving awareness. For us to welcome everything and push away nothing. No part left out. So that's my hope for our day, and I hope you'll join us in that. Thank you for joining us. Very happy to be with you. Let's see what we can learn together, okay? Susan.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you for reaching out to me, Frank. When we had originally, when Frank reached out to me, it was pre-COVID actually, and said, it'd be fun for us to do something together, for us to play together and to do a program and go to Garrison in person. And here we are. connected all virtually. And while we can't be together in person, we trust that this is still a time and a place that we can bring healing and bring connection to one another. So in the spirit of connecting, it would be really wonderful to just have you drop in the chat where you're writing from, where you are. Just help us to orient us and to one another of the beautiful community that's with us. And as you're doing that, I want to take a moment to thank Monique and Amy and our friends at the Garrison Institute for hosting us. And so we have people from New York and Kentucky, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Utah, Texas, Rhode Island, New Jersey, San Diego, Portland, Oregon, Atlanta. So it looks like US based, but both bi-coastal and places in between and north and south. Oh, well, Hawaii.
Yeah, someone from Austria as well, Susan.
And Austria, wonderful, wonderful. Tucson. So this is the joy of doing a virtual program, that we can be together. And I think from, my reflections at this time in doing a program on grief is that, well, I and Frank, we're really, for most of our careers, if not all of our careers, we've been working in one way or another in end of life care and in grief care, that this has not been a normal time. Yet all the normal losses that we have of losing loved ones, because we know we're all going to die and we're all going to get sick, and there's this mourning of health and losing loved ones, it's not been a normal time. And for me, the journey that I've been on, and the people in my life, let's just say that my father-in-law died last summer, and we knew he was dying, and we couldn't go see him. He was in another country, but even if he was in the same city, I don't think we could have gotten into the hospital to be with him. And then I couldn't be there for the funeral. And so many friends I know that's happened to, that we can't be at their sides and can't be at their funerals. And that's like a normal part of going through the death experience with those we love and care about. And then for my friends and colleagues that work in healthcare, the nurses and the doctors, a lot of my former students and friends have lost countless patients. And there's this cumulative grief of just feeling like you couldn't do enough to do what you're called to do, and even to just give a little pause and a space between the losses, because they were just too much and too cumulative. And then the other, really interesting aspect of this time that I think relates to grief, that's not specific to actually death, but just the other cumulative losses of the ways we used to live pre-COVID, and just these ambiguous losses that are really cumulative. It's hard to put your finger on all those, but they're cumulative. And I know for me, it's been like this shadow of this veil of just not able to fully connect with people in the fullest ways that we used to know, to just greet somebody and give them a hug without having to think about it. So it's just a kind of a funny time, not funny, but an unusual time in the journey of grief. And so my hope and intention, besides having a really lovely time with Frank and being able to, be with all of you and connect with you and to really be real together is to hope that after just this 3-hour time, that it's a little bit of a respite, a little bit of a time for you to just fully exhale and to be with whatever is true for you. And when we maybe can allow ourselves to do that, even for a few hours, it can be the fertile ground toward healing and wholeness. And continuing on. So thank you all for being here. Shall I proceed, Frank, with the
Yeah, let's just
standing
get,
practice? Anything you want to share? Anything else? And
no, let's just come into the room together, in a way, even if it's only virtually, but at least come into our breath and body for a bit. That will help us to connect with one another.
Yeah. So I invite us to come into this time and this space. And begin by feeling your feet, your body connected with the earth. Just dropping in and letting gravity just help you to drop in. Sort of like perhaps a small pebble dropping into a clear pond. Just gently dropping to this moment. And taking a few full breaths, really deeply allowing the air to come into you and flow out. And with each exhale, just letting go of any anticipation or expectation, any angst. Anything that was present for you before we came together. And just dropping into fullness of your being right now. Reflecting for a few moments on your intention for being here. Why did you choose to spend this time together? What's alive in your heart? What's alive in your body? Allowing your belly to be soft, receptive. Riding the gentle waves of breathing in and breathing out. And perhaps touching into the space between each in-breath and out-breath, and out-breath and in-breath. Settling moment by moment.
Grief is an experience of the body. And when we sense into our body, as we just did with Susan's beautiful guidance, it becomes apparent to us, what's living in us. Most often we think about grief as some overwhelming response to a single event, like the death of someone we love. But even just sitting here, I could feel that when I look more closely, that grief has been a kind of companion for me through the better part of my life. Sometimes our grief is about what we've had and lost, but sometimes it's about what we never got to have. And Susan, before the meditation, really helped us to remember that we're in an odd time, This is not something most of us are accustomed to. And our tendency for self-protection leads us to storing these experiences in some dark, cramped corner of our minds, But every loss triggers the memory of another. And the intense grief that rises from the loss of someone we love, in a way we rediscover the pool of grief that we've always carried, the ordinary, the everyday grief that inhabits our lives. I remember at Zen Hospice when I was there, there was this one woman, Connie, and she was dying, and she wanted us to contact her father. And her father lived, I think, in South Dakota, North Dakota, somewhere there, and he worked in a meat packing plant on the night shift. And so I called him up and I said, Connie's dying, and she wants you to come. And he said, all right, I'll be there in a few days. I'll take the train. He'd never been on an airplane before. And his name was Clyde. And I said, Clyde, no, you got to come on a plane. You got to come now. And so he said, all right. And called me back a little while later. He said, they tell me I'm going to be there at 10 o'clock. So I said, okay. And I went back into Connie's room and I whispered in her ear, your dad's coming. And he'll be here at 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And she kept whispering, 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And at 10 o'clock, when her father's plane touched down at San Francisco airport, Connie died. And as was our tradition there, Connie was part Native American. And so she wanted to be put in the ground as soon as possible. So we covered her body in sweet herbs and flowers and lemon geranium and sage and rosemary. Wonderful pile of leaves and sweet flowers. And after a while, her dad arrived at our front door and he rang the bell and I answered the door and I said, oh, Clyde, I'm so sorry to tell you that Connie died a little while ago. And he couldn't come in the room, he just had to pace back and forth for a while. And finally he came into the room and he sat on the bed. I remember he reached through the flowers and the sweet herbs and put his hand on her leg. And he stayed there on the edge of the bed for a long time. And at one point we went outside, so we could have a cigarette, and we're sitting in the backyard. And I said, Clyde, I can't imagine how this would be for you, for your daughter to die before you. It's not the way we normally think things will go. And he said, well, it's kind of familiar. And at first I didn't understand what he was talking about. But what he was really speaking about was this everyday grief of our lives. And Clyde had his share of it, and he said, it's sort of familiar. And he wasn't saying that his daughter dying was that way, but grief was familiar. Sadness is just one of the many faces of grief. And I think it's useful to think about grief is a kind of constellation of responses to a loss, you know. It certainly manifests as sadness, but also as anger and fear and self-judgment and regret and guilt. And there's a loneliness in grief. And sometimes there's a relief in grief. And there's blame and there's shame and periods of numbness where you feel like you're walking through molasses. And we're rarely prepared, you know, for the intense feelings that engulf us when someone we love dies. The sense of isolation, it's beyond words. I have a friend of mine, she's a Zen teacher and an extraordinary environmentalist. And after her father died, she got a call from some environmental group up in Northern California who wanted her to come and speak at this demonstration, this protest they were having to save the redwood trees. And when they asked her, she screamed back into the phone, "There are no goddamn trees. My father's died." Grief can come when we least expect it. You can be walking along, having a great day, and then a memory's triggered, and we find ourselves overwhelmed by this intense emotions, you know, that we didn't expect. You know, that same friend I was telling you about just a moment ago, she told me that this happened to her right in the middle of the cereal aisle in the supermarket. She just lost it, you know, between the Raisin Bran and the Cheerios. For me, in my experience anyway, grief is often an experience of the body. And so sensing the body, making contact with the body, feeling the pain or the dullness or the contractions, the nausea, the myriad of sensations, we become familiar with grief, you know. It gives us a greater access to our emotional states when we touch the body. Oh boy. Grief challenges our defensive shell of invulnerability. It exposes the way that we hide the truth of our human frailty. And there's no shortcuts through grief. There's only your way. And that's right through the middle, you know. Grief is completely unpredictable, uncontrollable. There's no right way, there's just your way. But our fear of that loss of control, it leads us to managing our grief, or talking about managing our grief at least, trying to get over our grief. And you know, it's curious to me that we never talk about managing our joy or getting over our joy. To be a companion to ourselves in our grief and to others in their grief, it's useful to know something about the territory. The danger is that we confuse the map with the territory. We reach for a lot of information that will take us past it. And if we impose maps on other people's grief, we often can do them a great disservice, maybe even harm them by our well-meaning efforts. There are lots of maps, there's lots of models, and they're useful to some degree. But I think we have to be really careful with them. That said, you know, for years at Zen Hospice, we had this way of describing the journey through grief. And it wasn't really a map or a linear path. Please don't understand it that way. But we called it loss, losing, and loosening. And loss is that first period of grief where you feel like you've been gut punched, you know. It's visceral and it takes your breath away. Even when death's expected, our bodies, our minds, they can't really take it in, at least not right away. Can't quite accept the reality that this has happened. We don't want to believe it. like there was this woman who died in our hospice, Linda, and her sister was with us at the time she died. And but at that moment, just as Linda was dying, her sister went down the hall to change her baby's diaper, actually. And while she was there in the bathroom changing the diaper, Linda died. And when she came back into the room, I said, "I'm sorry, Linda has died," when you went down the hall. And she said, "No, she's not dead." Now, clearly, Linda was lying in front of us without breath. She had died. There was no question about that, but it wasn't true for her sister. She said, "She's not dead." And I said, "Well, when was she most alive?" And she said, "Oh, when she was a young one, she was a rascal. And when she was a teenager, she started spelunking in caves. And later she was an editor for this left-wing magazine. She was a hellraiser." And she said, "You remember, then she got cancer, Frank, and then remember she fell the other day and she broke her arm and you had to take her to the emergency room. And then she came back and she stopped eating. Remember that?" I said, "Yeah, I remember. I remember." She had to tell the story to get real, to get current with what had happened. That's the work of this immediate experience of loss, the shock and disbelief, and it kind of gives way oftentimes to guilt and regret. We judge ourselves. I should have taken her to the hospital sooner. I should have known better. I wanted to be there when she died. It never ceases to amaze me that when we most need our kindness, when we most need our mercy, we club ourselves with self-judgment. If we could just stop for a moment, listen, hear the sound of our own voice, I know that our hearts would open and embrace the pain. It happens, after months or even years of caregiving for our mother who has Alzheimer's, continually witnessing her suffering. We feel ashamed when we feel relief when she's died. And it's especially confusing when the person we love has died and we're angry at them for dying. We didn't want them to die. There's no avoiding these painful states of mind. If you're supporting a person who's a survivor, it's important to recognize and acknowledge these feelings as real and understand them as perfectly normal. Some people cry oceans of tears and others feel too numb to cry. Men grieve differently than women. There's no right way, there's just your way. Watch the comparing mind. In this time, in this confusing time of loss, we forget our keys and we arrive at places and can't remember why we went. We can't concentrate, we're disoriented. A dear friend of mine, a few weeks after her mother's death, she walked by a store window and she saw this lamp that she knew her mother would like, and she picked up the phone to call her mother, who had died months before. She thought she was crazy. In the old days, people used to wear certain clothing, maybe wear black or armbands, that let other people know that they were in altered states and not to expect them to behave normally. In the first weeks after someone has experienced a loss, do their laundry. Help them fill out the insurance forms. And if you're experiencing that loss, cancel all your appointments. Walk if you can. Sleep all day if you need to. Sometimes restlessness will rule. You may not feel like sleeping at all. Find somebody to hold you. Let yourself be distracted. It's okay. And then there's this long period of losing, this painful period that can go on for some time, months, years even, you know. When someone we love dies, we don't just lose them once, we keep on losing them. You don't just lose your partner when she dies. Every night when you get into bed and the sheets are cold, you lose her again. Or if she was the one that did the banking business, when you go to the bank, you lose her again. Or if it's our parents that died, you know, maybe we feel more fragile ourselves because there's no buffer anymore between us and death. That generation is gone. We feel our own mortality more. And this is the time when we feel most alone. You know, friends drop away, they're tired of our grief, or they want to give us unwanted advice. They tell us to get busy, take dancing lessons. I remember this one person I worked with, her friends kept telling her she should get a dog. Advice doesn't help. Be with somebody else who's been through grief, who can just extend a non-judgmental listening. Grief groups, of course, can be really helpful, but not always. I asked one woman, I remember her husband's name was Romeo and he died. And I asked her what she really needed after her husband died. And she said, I wanted to tell someone how much I wanted to die. I always thought my husband and I were one. I couldn't understand how I could go on living when he's dead. But when I started to share these feelings with my friends, I could just see the fear in their eyes. And so I had to keep it to myself. There's this cliche that time heals, but that's a half truth. Time alone doesn't heal. Time and attention heal. The willingness to experience and investigate the pain directly gives rise to compassion. Then there's this period which comes along. We called it loosening. And it's in a way when the knot of grief becomes untied, you know, when it doesn't have you by the throat anymore. It's a time of renewal. Some of the emotional turmoil has been reduced, and there's a way that you can hold the loss in awareness. It's not a return to life as you knew it before death. There's no going back. You're a different person now. You've been changed by the journey through grief. You've been reconstituted. But you can begin to embrace life again. I remember one elderly woman described it to me this way. She and her husband had been married, I think, for 40 years. And she said that after he died, they always made their decisions together. And after he died, she'd make a place for him at the dinner table every night. And she'd make her dinner, she'd sit at the table, and she'd talk to him as if he were still there and ask his advice. And she always could hear his voice in a way in her head. You know, he was giving her advice about how to manage through her experience. She said after a while, maybe after a year or so, she stopped this habit of setting a place for him at the dinner table. And she said that she was finally able to make plans on her own. And she said, I take him with me everywhere, but now I decide where we go on vacation. So, yeah, there's lots of different faces of grief, and there's lots of models for grief, but again, don't confuse the models with the territory. Even this kind of description that I just laid out of loss, losing and loosening, don't take that as in a linear way. You got to find your way. The way through grief it's a slow, soulful process. It has its own time and rhythm, and it can't be rushed. Trust the process through grief. Trust the process through grief. It takes us from fragmentation to wholeness. And the thing that's most important in the process is love. Being really lovingly kind to ourselves. That's what's most important. All right. Enough words, really. Oh boy. So, yeah. Susan and I were thinking that maybe this might be time to do another practice, a little practice where we sort of evoke the experience of grief in our hearts and minds, and see what we can understand together. So get a position in which you can be comfortable, but also alert. When I sit meditation, I like to rock from side to side. Then I can feel those bones in my butt, those two sit bones. And I can see whether I'm putting more pressure on one than the other. And I can find a place of balance, the posture of balance. And then I like to rock forward and backwards, partly because it reminds me of my grandmother and sitting in her lap. I always love that. But also I can discover where I'm leaning into the experience too much and where I might be pulling back from it too much. And I can find that center point where I can sit right in the center of things, where I can sit alert, awake, comfortable still, with a sense of self-respect, a quality of dignity. Then I take a few intentional breaths just to feel my lungs, feel my belly. A long inhale deep into the body. A slow, complete exhale. Settling into the body just as it is. And then fling open all the doors and windows of the senses. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. Doors of perception. The more contact we have with the body, the easier it is to make contact with our hearts. And for a moment, maybe just bring your attention to hearing, to the experience of hearing, the sound of my voice, maybe the other sounds in the room. See that it happens with nothing extra. No, nothing else is needed. And as you attend to the sound, maybe you also become aware of the silence that's also here. Sense that silence for a minute. See that the sounds come and go. But the silence itself, it's undisturbed. How big is the silence? Is it just in your head? Does it fill the room where you are? Does it extend outside the building? Everything can come and go in that silence. And just as the sounds can come and go, so can your thoughts, so can your emotions. So if you're willing, see if you can invite someone into your mind's eye, into your heart, someone or something, like a job or your home, that you've loved and lost. Just for a few minutes, okay? I'll do it with you. And if it's a person, imagine them sitting right in front of you, holding them really gently and kindly in the gaze of your eyes. And if you like, you can place one or both of your hands very gently on your heart. That sometimes helps me feel into my body. And sometimes I even take my thumb and I gently press it to that point at the center of your chest between the nipples. It feels kind of sensitive to the touch, and I apply a very gentle pressure there, just so I can feel what's there, maybe what's pushing back. So much suffering in our lives, untouched by the heart. So much pain we've endured, locking our hearts down around the pain. Or maybe we've tried to avoid the pain by not being in our bodies at all. Come into the body. Come into the body with me. Come into the heart. It hurts too much to keep ourselves out of our own hearts. Sometimes it's helpful to repeat a few phrases. May I be open to the sorrow, kind to the pain of grief. Or may I find the inner resources to be present with my sorrow. Or may I be open to my judgments and resistance, knowing that they too will pass. Or maybe we've cared for someone and we felt like we always didn't do our best work, or that we said something that wasn't so helpful. So may I forgive myself for not always being able to meet my loved one's needs. May I forgive myself for my mistakes. Make room now for the pain, for the sadness, knowing I'm not only my sadness, all of it held in loving awareness. Feel the love of your most essential heart, your wise heart. Let the pain come, let the pain go. All held in loving awareness. Be kind. Be so kind to yourself right now. There's nothing more important. Kindness, mercy, compassion. If tears come, it's okay. It's okay. Let the tears water the heart that's been too dry. Let the crying loosen the calcification around your heart. Let it all happen in the safe container of the body. All the losses held. The fear, the insecurity, the self-doubt. When you need it, you can repeat one of the phrases, may I be open to my sorrow. May I forgive myself for my mistakes. The love I couldn't give. Loving awareness, gently dissolving, melting, the longing, the loss, the grief. Let all the faces of grief show themselves. Anger, the self-judgment, the regret, the guilt. the numbness. Breathe it all into your heart. We're not alone in our grief, in our losses. Because we're connected to all other beings and things, the grief is shared. And the great heart of compassion opens and recognizes the suffering in others. So may that loving awareness expand and include the losses beyond our personal losses. Suffering of our world. Innocent, starving children, bloating bellies. The mothers with empty breasts, unable to feed their babies. Families devastated by COVID. Violence in our schools. Racism everywhere. The inequality in our world. The effect of human domination on our troubled planet. Climate catastrophe. Open to the ocean of grief. Oh, be kind. So kind. You can feel the sensitivity, the throbbing, maybe just there under your heart or hands, softening the contraction, letting the pain into your heart. Your trustworthy, reliable heart that will not abandon you. Breathe in now to the center of your heart. Each breath, breathing in loving awareness. The whole body filling with awareness. Feel your body now. The strength of the upright posture. The balance on your sit bones. The centered uprightness. Not leaning in, not pulling back. Feeling the strength and loving equanimity. Let your hands rest in your lap now or in each hand. Just allow the grief, however it is. Allowing it allows us to pass through to non-grieving. Just a few more kind breaths. Nothing to do. No one special to be, no place special to go. Just here with your trustworthy, wise heart. Thank you very much for your practice. your eyes have been closed, you can open them again and come back into the room with each other. Nothing has to be healed, nothing has to be done with. We can just have the sense that we can keep company with our experience. That's all we need, just to keep company. Yeah. So we're just starting here. We're just getting going. But let's bring this with us to everything else we do today in our time together. Kind, kind, kind. Please be so kind to yourself now. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you. That was really beautiful. You walked us through a little journey of the faces of grief. And I love the images of all the different possible faces of grief that each of us experiences. It kind of, in my mind's eye, was bringing to mind my own face and the different faces of sadness and anger and numbness and just disheartedness, as well as full-heartedness and love and even joy, because actually the whole grief experiences, we have these moments that are memories that bring us back to the loving experiences and the joyful moments that are full of laughter.
Yeah, grief is the way we love.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like it's a love that's got no place to go.
Yeah. Well, we grieve because we grieve because we love.
Right.
If we didn't love, we wouldn't grieve.
Yeah.
Right.
Certainly not the same way. Sure.
Yeah. And so, so the joy and love really came to me in thinking about the faces of grief, and as well as the loosening. As we begin to loosen those, maybe we have more moments that are remembering those brighter experiences and those times that were really precious, that weren't just about the sadness, but actually brought us smiles and made our hearts glad. I wanted to acknowledge, in the chat, a couple of things that came up. One was, there's somebody who's part of our community right now who's at the hospital, whose partner is in the intensive care unit. And so that grief isn't just the moment that the loss is severed, but there's a whole process of before it happens, or even as it's happening, no matter what, you've lost the life that you knew before that person. So I just want to honor and let you know that we're with you as you're in the hospital. And I gave a particular shout out for doctors and nurses, but wanted to acknowledge and thank Nola for recognizing the therapists. Therapists are working way overtime, and there are not enough therapists and counselors available to support the tremendous grief that so many are experiencing right now. So just wanted to acknowledge that, and to realize that in the various forms of ambiguous grief that we acknowledged earlier is also the loss of feeling that we don't belong, and all the different ways that the isms get in the way of helping us to feel whole. And the more we feel othered, that is a loss.
Sometimes when we share our story, it's just, sometimes I need to share it 10,000 times. But when we share a story with another person, we can, at times certainly feel their resonance with us, and it's how we build an empathetic bridge to other people, oftentimes by going into our experience and then building a bridge from that to another. So I hope that was the case in dyads. But we just want to now hear from you. We want to know, what was it? What did you discover? You know, what did you discover in the writing, perhaps, or in the share? Uh, sorry. I think we have to divorce the notion of outcome, especially changing the other, from the practice of forgiveness. It's a relative practice that helps us come to an ultimate truth. It basically helps us to not turn away. And in my life, it's a fierce practice. To be real about forgiveness, to say, actually, you know, what's true, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's been a constant companion in my life, on the path to healing and discovery, I would say. It's a process that begins to heal a life that's been characterized by separation, right? I mean, there's this old image that everybody's used over the years of, you know, forgiveness is like holding a hot coal in your hand, and then forgiveness is setting down the coal so you don't keep burning yourself over the years. But I was talking to one of our patients at the hospice, and I used that analogy for her, and she said, I never thought about a hot coal or setting down my pain. He said, I forgive because I want to love again. Yeah, I want to love again. And it hurts too much not to love. And so I forgive in order to love. You know, one of the very first patients we ever brought to Zen Hospice, her name was Stella. And she, you know, came from a rough, tough life. And while she was with us, she wanted to contact her brother. Her brother was a cowboy. He rode the rodeo circuit. And this was before, you know, it was easy to Google somebody. And so we found him. We called the Rodeo Association. We found him. His name was Rusty. And one night he showed up at the doors of San Francisco Zen Center, where we were then having, Stella was our first patient, actually. And he had this big, you know, 10-gallon hat and snakeskin boots and silver belt buckle. And he looked around the Zen Center and he said, what kind of a place is this you got my sis, you know? And I said, come on in, you know? And we went upstairs and he walked the hallways. He couldn't go see her. And I said, well, how about you stay here tonight? You know, we gave him a room. I said, you stay here tonight and we'll try again tomorrow, you know? And so the next day we were sitting in the courtyard smoking cigarettes, and he's talking to me about this and that. They'd had a rough life. They'd been orphaned as kids and lived in orphanages and foster homes. And Rusty had been really tough with her. He had been abusive to her in every possible way. And we're sitting there in the courtyard, and he said, I want to tell her it, but I can't tell her it. And I thought, oh, I'm not going home to my kids just yet, you know. And I said, all right, Rusty, you tell me. You tell me. And I thought for myself, what am I doing? How can I'm not a therapist. I'm not a priest. How can I hear this? And then I remembered I once met the great humanistic therapist, Carl Rogers. He was a grandfather of a friend of mine, and we ran a preschool together. And Carl used to come and play in the sandbox with the kids. And I studied his work a lot. And he wrote something beautiful one time. He said, before every session, I take a moment to remember my humanity. There's no experience that man, that woman has had that I cannot share with them. No fear that I can't understand, no suffering that I cannot care about, because I too am human. And no matter how deep his wound, she doesn't have to be ashamed in front of me, because I too am vulnerable, Laurie. And because of this, I am enough. And whenever his story, that person no longer needs to be alone with it. And that's what allows the healing to begin. And I remembered that when I was sitting with Rusty, you know, and it's like what we just did in the dyads, you know, sharing our stories helps us to heal. And intuitively, I felt like the greatest gift I could offer Rusty was just to listen to him, to give him my undivided attention. And so I did, and he laid out this horrific story of their lives. And after it, I said, let's go upstairs and see your sis. He said, all right. And I came in, he pulled up a chair next to Stella's bed, and I remember the weeks before, Stella had asked me a question. She said, I'm here at this Zen hospice place, and there are all these Buddhists here, and some of them tell me to love, and others tell me to let go. And Frank, what should I do first? Love or let go? And I said, oh, Stella, you're going to know what to do. You're going to know what to do. I think love's the lubricant that allows us to let go myself. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Rusty sits down next to Stella, and he starts to pour out basically the story of their lives, and was about to make his apology. And then Stella held up her hand like this. It was so amazing to watch her. She held up her hand and she said, in this place, I have someone who bathes me. I have someone who feeds me. I am surrounded by love. There is no blame. And I felt like a whole lifetime was forgiven in that moment. A whole lifetime. Now, Stella didn't forget what happened to her. He wasn't condoning what had been done. But she was basically saying to Rusty, look, if you want to carry this pain around with you for the rest of your life, it's okay, but I'm dying and I want to set it down. She knew, she knew that if she wanted to be free, she had to forgive. And when I speak of freedom here, I mean, just the immediate freedom, the freedom from indictment about and the recriminations that we make about ourselves or others, the judgments that cause so much suffering. Stella wanted to forgive. She knew she was dying and she wanted to forgive. And our lack of forgiveness, it has this big power over us. It holds us back, right, from really experiencing our lives and ourselves. We can be really loyal to our suffering. But we don't have to let all the old hurts in our life continue to define who we are. We can let the past dissolve. We can leave it behind. Now, we all want to be free in this way, right? We all would agree, right, that forgiveness is a good thing. Pretty much. Everybody would shake their head, right? Forgiveness is a good thing. Yeah, everybody agrees. So here's the question. How come we don't do it? How come we don't do it? What gets in the way? That's what I want to know. What gets in the way? What's the prohibition to forgiving? What stops us? What prevents us from forgiving? That's really what's important to explore. And I'd actually like to explore it with you. I'd like to hear from you about what gets in the way of you forgiving. And let's be real with each other, because that's how we'll know about this. Forgiveness is not a Hallmark card. It's a fierce practice. And it causes us to have to see the parts of ourselves that are really ugly sometimes, and to touch those with some tenderness and mercy. Yeah.
Yeah. And to also lift up something else that's in the chat, I think is an important one, is the statement that some behaviors to this person who wrote it are not forgivable.
You bet.
And let's just unpack that a little bit, and just to maybe think about how not forgiving lives in our bodies, and how that stays present with us. And love your thoughts on that, Frank.
Oh, it's easy to talk about these things. It's a lot harder to live into them,
Yeah, it absolutely is.
I spent some time working in Guatemala. First, I worked in refugee camps in southern Mexico, then in Guatemala. And while I was in Guatemala, I was working in this little tiny clinic where the student doctor was working. And in that clinic that night came a young boy rather, who was maybe 5 years old. And she was clearly dying of a ruptured stomach, And so I went to the colonel who was in charge of that area, who'd flown me around in a helicopter. And I went to his door and I knocked on the door in the middle of the night and I said, we got to get this girl to a hospital. And he looked at me and he said, son indígenas, they're Indians, like they were lower than dirt, and he closed the door and that was it. And I went back into that clinic and that little girl died that night. Her father thought I was a doctor, and I had him holding her head, and her mother would pour this corn mash, it's kind of home brew, into her belly, and she died a miserable death. And when I came, I was furious. I was so angry. I was so full of hatred. And when I came home, I just did everything I could to stop the wars in Central America. But one day I was listening to the radio and Reagan was on, and I started screaming at the radio. And then I saw my son, who was 3 years old at the time, cowering in the corner. And I thought, oh, I got to stop this war. Not the war in Central America, the war in my own heart. And so every day I worked with forgiveness. I had pictures of Guatemalan soldiers and even of this colonel. I put them on my altar. And every day I practiced with forgiveness, and it never felt sincere. It always felt like it was just words. It was just words. And I couldn't forgive the acts that he had done. I couldn't forgive those acts. But eventually I was able to see the man, the person, and I saw myself in the man. And that's what allowed me to forgive, seeing myself in the man, seeing how much I hated him and how much his hatred had driven his actions. And doing that enabled me rather to forgive him. Not what he did. What he did was unforgivable.
Right.
But the man, his ignorance, his
That's it.
confusion, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
That's spot on. So the behaviors can't forgive the behaviors,
No.
but the ignorance and the suffering of the person who did it.
Yeah.
Marla asks about whether or not both parties need to be present for true forgiveness. And I'll share my reflections on that. And I'd say no. I think, forgiveness is really your journey. And the other's forgiveness is their journey. And by harboring the resentment and the guilt and the grudges, that takes a toll on you and your health, your well-being. It's this shadow that is staying, that just kind of is with you all the time. And the journey of deep forgiveness that comes from within you is freedom. It opens the door. It opens the door of freedom. And I know that a lot of forgiveness actually happens internally without the other person. They're already dead. Or in your example, Frank, it was somebody who you didn't have a personal connection with, but it was something that was feeling very unforgiving for you. So even if you can't be with the person, it doesn't mean that you can't engage in a process of a journey of forgiveness.
Yeah, and don't confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. I mean, they aren't the same thing. Forgiveness may lead to a meeting of the minds at some point, like when a child grows up to be an adult and they forgive their parents for not being perfect, But reconciliation isn't always the outcome,
Right.
Reconciliation requires two people. Forgiveness doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when you reconcile, you make an agreement for the future, When you have a fight with your partner, you say, I'm sorry, I hurt you, and I want to take responsibility for my actions, and I love you, and I respect you, and I'm going to try not to do that again. That's reconciliation, right? So don't confuse the two.
Yeah.
Susan was talking earlier about grief and kind of ambiguous loss, like we can't quite name it. We don't know what it is, like in COVID, is it just that I can't go to the pizza parlor I like, or is it I can't get my hair cut? It's ambiguous. We don't know exactly. It doesn't got a target, as you say. It doesn't have a specific thing. So some of it is just grieving that. It's not forgiveness. It's just grieving. It's just this hurt. And all these people were involved in it, and myself included, and it really hurts. And I want to let myself feel every aspect of that, and not turn away from a bit, because I always find that the healing is found by going right into the suffering, right? So it may not be about forgiveness, Yolanda. It may just be about, I need to grieve this, And it doesn't mean it's going to be over when I grieve it. I cry for 2 days and it's done. It means I got to live with this. I bring this into my life. That's how it is. I bring this into my life, and it gets metabolized by including it. And yeah, this is part of what my life. This is what's happened in my life, and I want to include it. I don't want to keep it at arm's length. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Yolanda. So I'm aware that Beth has her hand up, and we have a total of 10 minutes left of our time together. And I know that we really would like to have time for just a brief practice, just to resettle, just drop into a space of being and not talking. And then have some closing comments, if that Frank and I will share, if that's okay. Is that okay, Beth? Yeah, I'm sorry we don't have more time.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Susan?
So I will do like a 5-minute practice that is just maybe take a moment to stretch and move your body, shoulders, neck. Nice, full, big breath in and hold it. And release. And finding that seat of balance, as Frank was noting, it's kind of rocking left and right, front and back, and then finding a steady, stable center. And gently turning toward forgiveness for a few moments. May I know forgiveness. Just repeat that to yourself in your own way. Just repeating the words, the feelings behind the words. May I know forgiveness. May I forgive myself for not being there for others who may have needed me. May I forgive myself for my mistakes. May I forgive myself for things left undone. May I know forgiveness deep in my bones. in my heart. May I know forgiveness. And may I know love. May I know love. May I know that I have loved. May I know that I have loved. And may I know that I have been loved. May I know that I have been loved. And taking a few moments just to rest in the space of loving awareness, of okayness, right here, right now.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Frank.
Anything you want to add before we close? I know we have to close shortly.
Well, I have some closing words that I'd love to share, and a poem, and I think that you have some as well. So I'll do it. I'll begin, and then you can have the last word, Frank.
As you wish. Either way, doesn't
Okay.
matter.
So I'm reminded of the beautiful words of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. The everyday practice is simply to develop a complete acceptance and openness to all situations and emotions, to all people, experiencing everything totally without mental reservations and blockages, so that no one withdraws or centralizes into oneself. And so that brings me to a poem that I sit with quite a lot that I love, and it's a poem by Dorothy Hunt. And its piece is this moment without judgment. Do you think peace requires an end to war, or tigers eating only vegetables? Does peace require an absence from your boss, your spouse, yourself? Do you think peace will come some other place than here, some other time than now, some other heart than yours? Peace is this moment without judgment. That is all. This moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. Peace is this moment without thinking that it should be some other way, that you should feel some other thing, that your life should unfold according to your plans. Peace is this moment without judgment, this moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. So it's been really an honor to spend the last few hours with you, and a delight to be and teach with you, Frank. So thank you so much.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful passage by Dorothy Hunt. Beautiful. Oh, boy. Oh, well, I have a little grief that we don't have more time with each other. But I'm grateful also. That's often the way it is with grief. The two sides of the same coin, the feeling of loss and the feeling of gratitude. And I share Susan's comments about being happy to be with you, and grateful for those who've spoken and also those who've listened. You know, when we listen devoutly, it helps evoke the truth from other people. So thank you for those who listened well. Yeah, I got a poem too. The poets always say it's so good. You know, I take too many words. Poets say it so briefly. So there's a great poem by Ellen Bass, wonderful California poet, great writer. And it's called The Thing Is. The Thing Is. And often I think when we have grief or there's a challenge around forgiveness, we lose our hope. We just don't want to invest in life anymore. That's what happens. So here's a good poem for us. The thing is to love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it. And everything you've held dear crumbles like burnt paper in your hands. Your throat filled with the silt of it. When grief sits with you, its tropical heat thickening the air, heavy as water, more fit for gills than lungs. When grief weights you like your own flesh, only more of it. The obesity of grief. And you think, how can a body withstand this? Then you hold life like a face. No charming smile, no violet eyes. And you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. You hold this face and say, I will take you. I will love you again. Oh boy. Thank you all so very much for coming, first of all, and for your willingness to explore, and for the hard work that is. And I just want to encourage you at the very end here to trust your good, wise hearts. You know, they will be reliable guides for you. Not just your emotional heart, your wise heart, your essential heart. It will be a wise guide for you, a reliable guide for you. Your awareness won't abandon you. We can forget about our wholeness, but it's never lost. Yeah. Thank you very much for your willingness to be together. And thank you, Susan, for playing together. It was such a delight to be with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.